Let's talk about bad therapy. Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, guys, we're going to talk about bad therapy. I recently came across a book that I thought was quite phenomenal. It's called Bad Therapy, Why Kids Aren't Growing Up by Abigail Shrier. And Abigail Shrier has been kind of everywhere in the last couple of months because of this book. She appeared on Jordan Peterson's podcast. She was on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I also saw her on Mark Manson's podcast. And I've listened to all these podcasts and I am like, wow, she's affirming what I personally, as a clinical provider myself, have been feeling about, even going through different clinical rotations. I felt like the way we deal with mental health in this country is terrible. It's interesting because you think that you're alone thinking these things. I'm so glad that people are coming to the front and talking about these things that I think all of us are feeling. How is it that we're in a generation that is the most exposed to mental health therapy, but at the same time, mental health has never been worse? Why is there this contradiction? But I really want to specifically talk in this video to the antidote to bad therapy, because it's one thing if we can track the journey of what got us here, and what the situation is, but in terms of solution, what is then the solution to bad therapy that's been an epidemic in this country, and not just in this country but just in the Western world in general. All right, guys, so let's dive in.
Abigail, it's so good to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to the show. The book is Bad Therapy. It is all over. It's blowing up right now. I have to admit, I got triggered. I needed a safe space when I read this book. I was not expecting to be as upset by it as I was. And I think the reason is I came up in the self-help industry. I think I really built my career by pointing out a lot of the hypocritical and self-defeating tendencies in self-help. The idea that just because something makes you feel better doesn't mean you are better. And optimizing for your feelings all the time is kind of counterproductive in a lot of ways. And I guess throughout all of this, I always assumed that clinical psychologists had their shit together and were on the correct side of that dynamic. And reading your book was really upsetting because it showed all the ways that they're not. And so I'm curious, let's start with the idea of bad therapy. What triggered this for you? What inspired you to pursue this research, pursue this book, and what kicked this whole journey off?
I started by wondering, why was the generation that had received the most mental health, the most wellness tips, the most therapy, the most psychiatric drugs, the most frantic worry over their mental health and happiness, why were they so unhappy? Because they are. And why did they seem to have no interest in adulthood? Why didn't they show up to work on time? Why couldn't they be relied on? Why did they not want to form families? Why were they living with mom and dad in numbers we'd never seen? And they were content to do so. It's not like they were unhappy about living with mom and dad. They seemed pretty happy about it. So I kind of wondered why they weren't thriving generally, but I didn't think it had anything to do with mental health experts at the time, because 40% of them have been in therapy, which is still the highest percentage we've ever seen, but it was less than half. So I thought it had something to do with the way they were being raised. Maybe they were raised more gently, and I sold the book to the publisher with that hypothesis. But then I attended a 3-day conference of public school teachers here in California, and it was all about the mental health of this generation. I thought, okay, let me find out what they're doing in schools. And what I realized was that schools were all playing therapist. Parents were reading the best-selling therapists, parenting books. And I started listening to the way they talked. And they never say they're shy. They say they have anxiety or social phobia. They never say they're sad. They say they're depressed or they have depression. And they never say, oh gosh, I have a bad memory. They say, I have a flashback. That's my PTSD. So I realized this was a generation flooded with what I call bad therapy. They are swimming in the language of psychopathology, and it's making them sick.
The education piece, it's funny because the book kind of starts with a more focus on therapy itself. And as I read it, I was like, okay, I get this. I mean, there are bad therapists out there. Like, I run into plenty of them, but there are also really good therapists out there. And it's still, in aggregate, as you said, it's not the majority of the population that goes to therapy. And especially older generations, it's even less. But when I got to the education piece, that was really eye-opening, because it is introducing a lot of therapeutic concepts and psychological language into a domain where the people delivering it don't have the expertise or the experience to actually be having those conversations, especially with kids. And I think you also make the point that approaching a child with therapy is very different than an adult. Can you explain
Yeah,
why?
I mean, that's what I want people to know. It's totally different.
Yeah.
It's totally different. You know, an adult can say, listen, I know my mom shouldn't have said that, but I wouldn't call her emotionally abusive. An adult can say, look, I had a bad experience in middle school, but I don't think I have PTSD. And an adult can say, look, I've been with you for 2 years. I'm just as depressed. I'm sorry. I don't think this is working. A child can't say any of that. And a teenager can't say any of that, especially if she's angry with mom anyway, right? She's not going to say, I wouldn't call my parents toxic. That seems over the line. And so it's a totally different experience to put a young person in therapy because they can't work with the therapist to do the hard work of therapy at its best, right? They can't push back.
And that's because they don't have a frame of reference or...
Yeah, they don't have any life experience. They have no basis for saying, listen, that's not emotionally abusive of my mom, okay? She took away my phone because she thought I was overusing it. I don't think it's fair. I mean, what 14-year-old's going to say that, right? No, they're going to lean in. They're going to lean into that pain. They're going to lean into the idea they may have PTSD. It's natural to do so. You need to sort of be a grown-up to say, look, I have responsibility here too. It's very hard for a teenager because, first of all, they are struggling. A lot of them are in distress. A lot of them do have angst. We all did. And what they don't know, this is the most important thing, they don't know it's normal. They don't know it's normal. They don't know they can get through it. They don't know that every generation has. So if they're sitting with someone who is getting paid regularly by their parents to encourage the idea or at least talk to them 1 week, 1 day a week about their anxiety. Gosh, that's better than sitting with a bipolar patient, a schizophrenic patient, or anyone who might be violent in your session but desperately needs your help.
How would you define bad therapy and how does it differ from good therapy?
Right. So bad therapy is anything that introduces new symptoms or makes existing symptoms worse. And there's a whole body of really good research on the harms of therapy, which doesn't mean all therapy is bad. Every good intervention also comes with harms. We know this from x-rays to Tylenol. They can offer to surgeries. They all can introduce a harm. So the question is, do you really need it? And when they've done research and they do that, with a control group and actually rigorous research, they have found that people who burn victims, first responders to catastrophe, breast cancer survivors, people dealing with normal bereavement have all left therapy feeling worse. Because sitting around once a week talking about your pain can make you feel worse. And the problem is we're doing this to school children every day in school, their parents, their teachers. Everyone is saying, how does that make you feel? How do you feel? Think about your feelings. Dwell on your bad feelings. And here's the thing. People might say, oh, well, they're asking about their feelings. It doesn't have to be negative. They could be asking about good feelings. Okay, that's true, but that's not how it works. Why? Because if you're going to have something like social emotional learning in school, where the whole point supposedly is to teach emotional regulation, well, if you talk about a time when you were happy, there's nothing to teach.
Right.
So the whole conversation gets going when they say, okay, let's talk now about a time you failed, were left out, were rejected, were disappointed, or had your feelings hurt. Now we're talking. Now we got something to talk about. So it leads them towards the negative.
Right.
Always the negative.
And there's a subtle form of social validation, right? So it's like if a kid comes in and notices every time they say, I'm happy, I feel good, they get no attention.
Right.
But every time they come in and say, well, I'm really upset because, Susie was mean to me yesterday.
Right.
That gets them tons of attention. Well, guess what? Now they're like looking for things to be upset about and to come in and talk about.
Exactly. And what would be better for kids than sitting around and talking about their pain before a math test? And here's the thing.
It doesn't help with math.
Anything. They could literally be picking up trash around the school, paint the gym, dancing is really good apparently for dealing with mild to moderate depression, better than, psychotherapy or antidepressants. So literally anything we had them do that had an outward focus would be better than sitting around and talking about their pain. But that's what we're inviting them to do all day long.
My frustration with a lot of this too is that I think arguably the most important thing school teaches you is to still take the math test when you feel sad.
Yes.
Or still study for a big project when, you got dumped and your heart's broken, right?
I think one of the reasons why the way we treat mental health in the West is so problematic, from kids even to adulthood is the fact that therapy is incredibly egocentric. It's all about your feelings, how you feel, what they did to you, that rumination with these negative feelings. It's so cuddled. It makes sense because, what can be more lucrative than, having a person talk about themselves for, 50 minutes instead of taking people out of their head, and providing a context in which they live, say, you might have experienced this terrible thing, but you know what? There's people who've gone through something worse. Can you read stories of people who went through horrific situations and came on the other side victorious, more resilient, rather than taking people out from themselves? What bad therapy does is takes people deeper inward. And that is incredibly problematic, and this is why people don't actually feel better. And here's the thing, for this generation, for these kids, that have these helicopter parents, who constantly ask them how they feel, is so destructive because, it encourages a certain degree of self-absorption, this kind of victimhood, which is really, really problematic, instead of saying, I think one of the number one things that kids need, I believe, in our generation is a God-affirming identity. What do I mean by that? An antidote to bad therapy is not kids, ignoring their feelings, saying like, oh, your feelings don't matter, but it's also not ruminating and focusing on your feelings so much that's all you talk about. A real antidote to bad therapy is a God-affirming an identity. And what do I mean by that? Is telling kids the bigger story. The fact that you were made in the image of God, that you're not just a random, concoctions of, cells just walking around the universe, that you have a purpose, that God made you, that God loved you, that he saved you, that yes, part of the reason, that we have so much suffering in the world is the fact that we live in a sinful world, in a world where men strayed, and we all are prone to sin, but God came and redeemed us, and if we live in that knowledge, we can be victorious. Even if bad things happen to us, just like they happened to Christ, we can overcome that. God can help us, like whenever we teach and empower our kids to have a God-affirming identity, they're going to be victorious. They'll be able to walk into the world with a confidence, not arrogant, narcissistic, or self-induced kind of confidence that is rooted in their creator, in something much higher than themselves, because we as humans need that. When kids can be grounded in that, they live in the world knowing that, they're to expect hardship, because God said the world is broken, but they can overcome, and they have security that, that pressure to figure everything out is not just on them. God has promised to walk with them through this life. And that is what makes somebody truly, truly powerful, is that they know that their confidence doesn't come from their selfish ego. Their confidence comes from the Lord. More than anything, what you often hear with these bad therapists is just like, oh, just get more massage sessions. Make sure you check in with your therapist and talk about your feelings. Make sure, you go on vacation and just relax, learn to relax. It's all about you. One of the best ways to get out of depression, anxiety, and this focus on yourself is to go and serve, It's to like go to a third world country and just live there for a minute. Look how people live, You will get much more gratitude for what you have, Just do something like that, go visit your neighbor, go and volunteer somewhere where people are really going through something more painful than you are facing, Take the focus outward. You will instantly feel better. But that's not what they teach. What these therapists or these, modern shrinks want, or I would say they're kind of like the shamans of the Western culture, What they want you is to create this codependence where you're constantly coming to them. You're not making progress, because they want to keep you attached, because you know what? That's how they make money off of you. So and people more than ever don't have friends, they're more isolated, which all products of this egocentric culture that we live in. So people, they are codependent, and they're terribly attached, and they re-raise a whole generation that lives in fear, and they feel like they not have the tools, they don't have the power to make decisions for themselves. So what's needed really is a God-affirming identity for people to go back, because here's the thing, this is a much deeper conversation, because it's like what's gotten us into this mess in the first place, is the increased secularization of culture. Because here's the thing, if you've killed off God, as Nietzsche said, what happens? You're in control now, right? You're in control. And can you imagine what immense pressure it is to make all these decisions that people live in fear. They feel like they have to talk to an expert. They have to talk to somebody outside of them to help guide them. And here's the thing, when you live in a culture that doesn't believe in God, who doesn't believe in that the Lord can help you with your life, the next best thing is another human being. But hey, another human being is another broken person. You know what I mean? They have problems of their own. You don't even know what their life is like. You don't even know this person should be guiding you. And the Bible says, cursed is the man who puts their hope in man. That is what's become with this modern day therapy, is that we've called off God. We don't have a higher way of understanding that there is power in a relationship with God apart from another human being. There's no one who can help you like God can. Another human being cannot truly deeply help you. The best they can do is listen well. Okay. In fact, I would say what's even better than a therapist is a good friend, but people are missing really good friendships to begin with. So my hope is that this generation can turn to God, because, there's no greater freedom. There's nothing better to attach your identity to than to Jesus and live with real confidence. It's not a naive kind of confidence that it's like, oh, life is not going to, no, that life is going to be really hard at times, but that you have the presence of God to help you through that walk of pain, and that he will, even if he allows these situations, it's under his control. Nothing will happen to you that God is not overseeing, and God is going to help you build resilience. That is the promise. And I do believe that that's what this generation needs. That's what kids need so bad, but here's the thing, we've killed off God. All we have is, atoms and cells and randomness. We don't know how to help young people. And this is why these shrinks, they seize the opportunity. They seize the opportunity to become the modern Western shamans, if you will, who have this hold on young people. Jesus says, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And that truth is Christ. And when you get into the relationship with Christ, you will have the freedom to live a truly empowered life.
And so these poor kids that you're talking about who take their mental health diagnosis as their identity, they do that because they accrue the benefits of differential attention for doing so. It's unbelievably toxic. And it's such an indictment of our entire education system, too. You imagine that what we're offering young people as a vision of the future is so unbearably toxic and counterproductive that they will choose to be diagnosed with a mental health disorder in preference to normality.
Yeah. I mean, that's right, obviously. But there's another problem, which is, why are parents handing over their kids to therapists at the first indication of any problem? In fact, no matter how minor deviation from a benchmark, they go to diagnose and medicate. And the problem is, not only do we not know what goes on in that room, not only does the profession make no effort to track harmful effects of their interventions, unlike doctors who are mandated, to report side effects of their drugs. Not only is that going on, but we're seeing kids have these harms, and there's no feedback mechanism. Anxiety is worse. Therapists don't track whether their treatments have made anxiety worse or depression worse for a kid. And we know therapy can do that. And we certainly know the therapeutic interventions, the focus on feelings constantly ruminating on sad moments in your life, the way they're asked to in school. All of that is very bad for mental health. And constantly questioning everything you're going to do before you do it. All of these are the opposite of what we would want young people to do. And that's what therapeutic schooling efforts have done, parenting efforts have done, and actual therapists have done. And I'll say, the last thing is that, parents' unwillingness to assert their own authority in their homes has been a disaster, because it let therapists in the door to be that authority. And unfortunately, unlike parents, therapists are incentivized to keep the least sick coming back for the longest period of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to defend parents for a moment because,
sure.
I'd like to shed light on why they do that. I mean, the narcissistic, compassionate types, so they're the ones that tilt towards borderline personality disorder, let's say. So we know maybe that about half the mothers of daughters who have rapid onset gender dysphoria and who move forward with therapy and treatment, up to half of them are diagnosable with something like borderline personality disorder. That's a big problem. So one of the characteristics of people with borderline personality disorder is that they will manipulate other people in any way that you could possibly imagine to gain attention for themselves. And if that means sacrificing their children to their pretensions of compassion, that's no problem at all. Now, if you're in a relationship with someone like that, the probability that you're going to be able to withstand that pressure, especially when the system itself has its guns aimed on you. And if you do stand up and say, I don't think my child should be heading in that direction, that you're going to be pilloried as uncaring and as a victimizer. And then it's even worse because the bloody therapists, and this is where I'm most appalled about my colleagues who've accepted this claim emanating from the worst of the psychopaths that, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Now, I tell you, man, there's not a parent, an ordinary parent, like a non-psychologically trained parent on the planet, who, when faced with that accusation by a physician or a psychologist, isn't going to fold. Say, oh my God, this is worse than I thought. There's some risk that my child will commit suicide. And if I don't get on board with this in every possible way, and something terrible happens, it's going to be laid at my feet. And then if the accusations of being uncaring and victimizing are going along with that, well, it's just... And then the other thing, too, that's happening, Abigail, is that parents just can't believe these things are happening in their schools. Like I'm seeing this in Canada. I know Canadians are so asleep that it's kind of miracle. And I've tried to think that through. It's like, okay, how can people be so bloody blind? And then I think, okay, you can stay blind and assume that it's still 1990. So roughly speaking, the political parties do what they say they'll do and they're trustworthy. The legacy media isn't lying all the time. The educational institutions aren't completely corrupt. The judiciary is still intact. The legal system hasn't twisted itself into knots. Or you can dismiss all that as some sort of right-wing conspiratorial thinking and continue along your merry path. And if the price you pay for that is that the psychopathic teachers get their clause in your child, by the time you figure that out, it's going to be a bit too late. And I'm really seeing this especially in Canada. It's like people, even if you bring these things to their attention, they think, and I can understand this, they think there's no way things can be that bad. You have to be imagining it.
Another part I think that is problematic to this whole discussion of mental health is that, because we live so-called in a secular society that doesn't believe in God, let's just say, or predominantly doesn't, right? Because the West's been infected by this. One of the things is that we now treat depression and anxiety the same way we treat something like blood pressure. Even though those things are incredibly not the same thing. For instance, with blood pressure, I can truly objectively measure what your blood pressure, I can put an instrument to your arm, I can see what your systolic number is, I can see what your diastolic number is, and we can really see what your blood pressure is. Is there an apparatus that I can attach to your brain, to that kid's brain, and truly measure their anxiety and depression? How is it that anxiety and depression is in the same sort of way of treatment like something like blood pressure, to where we have a pill for anxiety and depression? What we have done is that we've reduced, the human mind, these feelings, of anxiety, these not physical things. These are metaphysical symptoms. These are not objective symptoms, but we treat them the same way we would prescribe a pill for blood pressure. A pill works for blood pressure, but a pill does not truly work for anxiety and depression, because that is something outside the physical realm. It's a metaphysical manifestation. And what we've done, though, with our human experience, that we've reduced ourselves to just physical beings, because we believe in atheism. But see, when you believe in a God, you believe that you are made by God. You understand that you are a spiritual being first and foremost, that you live in a greater context. Everything changes, meaning changes, and that is because we've applied this reductionistic approach to our human experience. Now we don't have any ways of really addressing these symptoms that we have. Why am I feeling sad and depressed and out of purpose? Instead of helping people guide towards spiritual answers, we just stuff them with pills and just ruminations over their feelings, which makes the whole thing worse. After listening to Abigail, my question is that, so do we just revert back to the boomers generation where, all feelings were ignored and people just, did it, and just never talked about the feelings and whatnot? What is the solution, And you would say, well, it's a balance. Well, I don't think that's fully the solution. I do believe that people need to go back to asking spiritual question, real philosophical question, real, understanding that this whole human experience is not just atoms colliding. This is a story of a creator, because that's how we are wired. We understand ourselves within the bigger context, reminding people you're not the main character. You're not the biggest. There is a true main character, Christ, who you need to attach yourself to. And then from him, you will understand everything else in your life. And that is where the real power to live a truly free life lies. And I really truly want to give this amazing biblical example. For instance, King David, he wrote the Psalm. And what you see in Psalms is a man who is not stuffing and denying his feelings, but it's also a man who is not ruminating in his feelings and allowing himself to be a victim of his feelings and just allowing feelings are good things. Feelings, if anything, they should drive us. They're pointers that you need God for first and foremost. That's what feelings show, is that you are in a spiritual deficit. You need to attach your identity to God, So what you see in Psalms is a man who does talk about the rawness of his feelings, how he's feeling. But at the end, he attaches his identity to God. He says, you know what? Even though I'm going through all of this, I will put my hope in God. I will trust in God. And he speaks that into his life and he walks with confidence. Not this egocentric confidence, but a God-inspired confidence. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.